A poet presented his badly composed verses to the king. The king did not receive him well and asked him whose son he was. The poet said he was the nephew of a famous author, at which the king burst out laughing. The king said, "I once read a book containing a fable which I now see before my eyes." They asked him what it was, and the king said, "A fox found a newborn mule in a field, and, surprised, asked him, 'Who are you?' The mule said he was a creature of God. The fox asked him, 'Have you a father or a mother?' The mule said, 'My uncle is a noble horse.' And just as this mule did not claim the ass as his father because it is a lazy, ugly animal, so this poet is ashamed to confess his father."
Ho-dee-oh-ho, 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 ho. Hello, and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time around, we have read the Disciplina Clericalis, translated as The Scholar's Guide in the English translation we're looking at, by Petrus Alphonsi.
It's a very strange little book.
Yes, it is. Yes, this is a very curious book made up of lots of little tiny parts that are connected to each other in very, let's say, unstable ways.
You did not love it.
I didn't love it. I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it, no.
I thought you might like it because you like weird little books.
I do like knowing about it, and I don't mind having read it. And it is a weird little book, and I appreciate it for that. And I guess I have things to say about it. It's also, in many ways, like the most normal medieval book I've ever read. I read this book and I was like, oh, wow, this is making medieval choices left, right, and center. And I guess we'll talk about that, but not medieval choices in the sense of what most people who just know a little bit about medieval literature might think of. I mean, this is nothing like Dante. It's nothing like King Arthur. It's nothing particularly like Chaucer. You could make comparisons, but like, it's really not doing that kind of thing.
It's like a weird little compilation, not a grab bag exactly, but a strange assortment, a strange sequence of lots of little parts, like you said.
And it's mostly composed of very short stories. You know, this reminds me of a story, that reminds me of a story. We're going to jump from one story to the other story. And they're all told very economically, very efficiently. They're just, a page, 2 pages, maybe 3 pages long each. And for me, that made it really tricky. My brain doesn't play well that way. I have a lot of difficulty when I'm reading in entering a new fictitious world, and then a bit of trouble exiting it. I like to talk about things afterwards and let it linger as long as possible. But like, short stories are not my favorite form. If I'm going to use up the emotional energy to invest in a world, I want to stay there for a while. So a collection of short stories is just like, oh no, I have to do it again and again and again. The hardest part of reading for me, I keep having to do it again.
And you know what? It's got to be incredibly exacerbated here because, like you said, these stories are very short, very economical, as opposed to something like The 1001 Nights or Boccaccio's Decameron or something where you have enough time to really get into the story and get back out. And with The 1001 Nights, sometimes the stories are nested and nested, you know what I mean? So you go in and in and in and then climb back out. Or with the Decameron, there's going to be 10 stories every day. Like you know what the overall structure is. So that's really different from this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you have no idea with this one where you're going next.
No, it's like comes out. And you get these weird little lists of aphorisms every now and then. I kind of love them, but they're like, what?
So let me try to describe in a little bit more detail what the book is like. We begin with a prologue, I suppose I should say, in which, sort of in the third person, but not really. In the very medieval style. It starts, Petrus Alphonsus, a servant of Jesus Christ and the author of this book, said, I give thanks to God, who is, like that first sentence was written by someone else, which I guess it might have been, but it doesn't matter even if it had been written by Petrus Alphonsus, or Petrus Alphonsi, however you want to say it, it would still have been in the third person because that is a very medieval thing to do. And it's like, okay, yeah, we're doing this. But the prologue sort of lays out what he's trying to do. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But basically, he's trying to put forth a nice and educative text. We'll talk more about that in a second. But he does say that he has compiled this volume from the parables and counsels of the philosophers, in part from the parables and counsels of the Arabs, from tales and poems, and finally from animal and bird fables, which is such a heterogeneous list that you do get a kind of a sense of what's going to come. And so you have the first couple sections, which just consist of a few very short aphorisms or, smart thoughts that you might write down in your diary about various topics on the fear of God, on hypocrisy, etc. And then a few animal fables, the ant, the cock, and the dog. is the first one. But then some of them start spilling out into longer stories. And so that story, in fact, spills out into what's listed here as the parable of the half-friend. And that goes on for a few pages. And then you get another parable that comes out of that, because you sort of emerge into this dialogue between a father and a son. And the father is trying to educate the son with these stories. So you think, okay, well, maybe that's where we've landed. And they go back and forth with a bit of storytelling and a bit of aphorism sections about various topics. But then eventually we just sort of leave them behind, and we have some aphorisms for a while. And then we've got a philosopher and a student who are trading stories back and forth. And then that leads to like a king and a subject giving their tales back and forth. And it just keeps jumping from one thing to another. It never settles on an overall frame narrative.
It's interesting you say that, because I understand it as being like dialogic. In other words, it's storytelling, but it's also continuously in the dialogue format. And the nature of that dialogue is one of the really important aspects of what's going on here. And it might be interesting if we talk more too about the ways in which the teacher-student relationship maps onto and does not map onto the father-son relationship, because they're kind of in tandem here. And in fact, the medieval French translation of this text gets translated into a whole bunch of different versions, actually makes it just about a father and son. So thinking about that relationship and what the dialogue is doing is a big part of what's going on here.
That's definitely a choice that I could see a translator making, just to try to make heads or tails of what's going on, of just simplifying it into father and son. But I think in the version that we have here, that the father and son disappear for quite a while.
Well, people make sense of that by saying, well, they're father and son and teacher and student, as if these relationships map one onto the other. But I think it's a little bit more subtle than that.
I think it's showing a few different types of teacher-student relationship over the course of it. And there's some interesting things to say about that. But before we get into that anymore, who is this author who is telling us all of these tales, often from the Arabic, but in a Christian context?
Yeah, let me say a little bit about him. And actually, maybe that'll also illuminate the ways in which the dialogue is something that kind of permeates a lot of his work. So Petrus Alphonsi is the name we know him by, but as he himself tells us in one of his works, his birth name was Moses. He was a Sephardic Jew living in what is now Spain, but it was at that time part of the Muslim kingdom of Saragossa. And without going in a lot of detail about it, Iberia, where Spain and Portugal is now, was at that time split. And so it had been under the rule of Islamic kingdoms and was sort of changing over and being sort of reconquered, as sometimes people put it, by Christian rulers. And he was educated within an Islamic system of learning where Arabic was the language of science, philosophy, and literature, and Jews and Christians were integrated fully into public life, including participating in court culture. The city he was living in at that time, Huesca, was conquered by the Christians in 1096, and 10 years later, in 1106, Moses was baptized and became Petrus. And we know the date. It was the 19th of June, which is the feast of St. Peter and St. Paul, which is where his new first name comes from, Petrus. And his godfather was the King of Aragon, Alfonso I, and that's where his new second name comes from, Alphonsi. And this is a big deal. Like, normally the king is not your godfather, right? So we know he was a really important person. We don't know his exact age because we don't know his exact date of birth, but he has to have been fully established as a scholar, as a physician, as an astronomer, as somebody who was valued by the king, right? So that tells us something right there. So we don't know a whole lot about his life in Aragon other than what he himself tells us in one of his other works, in particular his Dialogi contra Judaeos, his dialogues against the Jews. And it may seem weird that somebody who was himself Jewish would write an anti-Judaic, anti-Semitic polemic, but this is exactly what he does, and he does it in this super weird way. The dialogue is between Moses and Petrus, so between himself and himself. And it's super weird. It's super interesting. So it's a series of 12 dialogues. The first 4 are about Judaism, the 5th is about Islam, and the last 7 are about Christianity. And needless to say, the result is, yay, Christianity is the best. But what's really interesting is the account he gives of Judaism, which is very different from what you see in other anti-Judaic polemics of that period. It gives us a lot of insight, in particular, into Talmudic Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, which is something different that the kinds of polemics we saw before that might show. Anyway, there's a lot to say about that work. It's super fascinating. But in terms of biography, it tells us a little bit about his later life. Manuscripts of the Dialogi which was finished in 1110, tell us that Petrus went to England as a master of liberal arts sometime a little bit before 1116. And when he was in England and in northern France, he was serving, again, the royal court, this time serving as physician, astronomer, astrologer to Henry I. So this is somebody who was really well connected, really respected, kind of desired at the highest level. And so if we think about what he brings with him from the Iberian Peninsula, from this Islamicate environment he grew up in, this Spanish Christian environment that he worked in for some period of time, then he goes to northern France and to England. What does he bring with him? He brings astronomy, and I'm going to say just a little bit about that because I think it's super interesting, and the dialogue genre. Dialogues are a very old form of writing, and we see it obviously, like in Greek antiquity, and you see it in very influential texts in the Middle Ages like Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, which is where the narrator is talking to philosophy, who's like a personified woman. But what Petrus does is he kind of brings out a dialogue format, both in his dialogues against the Jews, but also in his Disciplina Clericalis. He gives it a different kind of flavor, a flavor that's going to become really popular in the 12th century among scientific writers. So he's an odd figure who touches on all different aspects of medieval culture. When he's in England, he works with a guy called Walsher of Malvern, producing astronomical work, which I could talk about all day because I find it super interesting, but I won't. I'll resist the temptation. But he brings with him also canon tables, that is, tables that you use to calculate the position of the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars. He clearly brings that with him. And Adelard of Bath, who's a really important scientist of the 12th century, translates into Latin these Arabic canon tables. And to the best we can tell, they come with Petrus. Petrus brings them when he comes from Iberia to England. So we don't know if he wrote the Disciplina Clericalis while he was in Spain or while he was in England, but the majority of the manuscripts that survive are from the British Isles and northern France, which tends to suggest that there's a good chance that that's where it was produced. But the work is really kind of a fusion of cultures, or a kind of crossroads of many cultures. The Jewish culture of Al-Andalus, the Islamicate culture of Al-Andalus and the educational Arabic language systems that he had come through, Christian Spain that he spent part of his adult life in, and then also Norman France and England. That environment also leaves its mark on his writing. So it's a weird little text, but it's also kind of displays the marks of a lot of different cultures in this period in the 12th century when a lot of stuff was happening. So it's a very peculiar and I think really interesting glimpse into that chapter of the medieval past. And it is educational, this text, in a certain kind of way that we might want to talk about.
I do want to say before we talk about that it really isn't shy about how it's getting its stories from these various different sources. It's not trying to obscure the Arab influence of them.
No, he talks about it a lot. He's real explicit.
He's not changing names from Arabic names usually, and it's fine, right? You might think, oh, this is somebody who's converted. This is somebody who's written Christian polemics. Maybe they would have weird attitudes or be dismissive of like heathens or something like that. It's none of that.
No.
It's just, here's a story. It's about some Arabs. Here's what they did.
Well, and also he's clearly valuing and like bringing over certain elements of Arabic culture. And it's not just the content of the stories, it's also names and things like that. So, for example, when he mentions Enoch, who's a figure from the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, right? He'll also give the Arabic name. He's also known in Arabic as Edric. He'll say, and when he mentions the character Balaam as another wise man, he'll say, who in Arabic is Luqman. And that's a character in the Quran, right? So like he'll remind us of this Arabic language world that he knows so well, and that is really interesting. But he'll also have these kind of explicitly Christian sections, especially at the opening and close of the Disciplina Clericalis. So that again, that's what I mean by the juxtaposition. Like he's going to give you this Arabic learning, and he's going to give you this Christian content, and he's going to give you these bird fables. Like he's going to give you all these different things.
But it's also true that the Christian content is not all that Christian in the sense that it's not dogmatically Christian, right? Like he's not saying the Trinity this or anything like that. All of the moral tenets would fit in any of these contexts, certainly.
It's true. It's more, I guess you could say, kind of Abrahamic religions, right? So the opening, there's a certain amount of sort of Christian contextualization on the opening pages, but the last several chapters I think are so cool because in a very subtle way, they kind of bring you to the end and they make you think about ending in this really interesting way. So like the last few chapters, the last few sections have a kind of move toward higher things. Like there's a section that's on safeguarding what is precious. And it seems at first just like another one of these usual kinds of edifying tales, right? But it moves into basically a sort of reminder that you should store up treasures in heaven would be the Christian way of talking about this. But it's not only a Christian kind of perspective, right? It's something you might also see, particularly in Muslim societies. I don't know if this would be as true typically in Judaism, where there's not the sense of an afterlife in the same kind of way. So after a couple of stories of this sort, we get a section that's explicitly sort of about death, some aphorisms about death, and the parable of the philosopher who passed through a cemetery. Right? It's told of a certain philosopher that upon passing through an old cemetery, he saw a marble slab. On it were inscribed verses. And then there's a kind of memento mori kind of verses that you should pray for those who have died and think about the kingdom of heaven. And then we get a section, which is super cool, which is the parable of Alexander's golden tomb. It said of Alexander that his tomb was gold and that it was placed in a court which was accessible to everyone. Many philosophers came to see it, one of whom said, Alexander treasured gold. Now, conversely, gold treasures Alexander. Another, yesterday the whole world was not sufficient for him. Today, only a few feet suffice him. Another, yesterday he ruled over the people. Today the people rule over him. And it goes on with this list, right? And it ends, it would take too long to recall what each of the 32 philosophers present said about the most powerful king. It's a super neat little passage in that it's like funny and aphoristic, but also it's like Alexander the Great. Like this is a figure who's important in so many different traditions, right? So it's a kind of a universal point of reference, but it's reminding you about the end, about the end of things and, what gold buys you and what gold doesn't buy you. So it's not, you're right, it's not Christian exactly, but it's got this, I don't know what to call it, a kind of a religious or devotional framework that accommodates itself to Christian readers' expectations, but it is also perfectly able to fit into other kinds of faith traditions as well.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And that section you just read about the tomb is kind of remarkable, and there's a lot you could say about it. It was really interesting, I'll say first, to get to the end of this book and have all of these sections about death and think, wait a minute, has there been a structure all along? And the answer is, no, not in
so
that
much.
sense, but it is good to end your work with a collection of thoughts about death. So maybe saving that for the end was something on the author's mind.
I feel like there's kind of a structure, like there's an opening, there's an entranceway, okay? Like there is an entranceway and then there's an exit, right? You enter in, there's kind of that part that, you were summarizing earlier, where he basically says how he's compiled the volume, taking it from parables of the philosophers, counsels of the Arabs, tales and poems, animals, bird fables, right? So there's an entrance, right? There's that kind of like, what are we doing here? This is what we're doing here. And there's that close where it's like, there's the end, there's death, there's closure, there's, that historical perspective and that personal fate. And then in between, it's like almost like a train track, right? In between, there's the dialogue.
Right.
Back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth. And so that's a very weird kind of structure, I grant you, but I think there is one.
I mean, sure, but it's not the sort of Dante-esque totalizing structure. It's more what I meant. You definitely have stations along the way or fields that you pass through with all these storytellings. You've got, let's talk about women and badmouth women for a while. Let's do a bunch of animal stories for a while. There's a few other themes that emerge and get played with for a while before you move on.
Well, I like this, what you said, that it's like fields you pass through. I mean, it is like that. It's like you're moving through this landscape. It's like, hey, look at that. Hey, look at that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The other thing that I found really interesting about the Golden Tomb section that you read was, you have 32 philosophers quipping or saying something profound, which I think is what philosophers prefer to think of quipping as, about this situation, about Alexander in his golden tomb with all the people around him. We get looks like about 8 of them on the page.
Yeah.
And they're all very different. And then we get told that there are, 32 of them there. There's more, and we're not going to say it. And this sort of says something, I think, about the nature of
absolutely
philosophy, or the nature of the philosophy as it's understood in this text anyways, which is saying pithy things that you might want to write down in a notebook. In that there are lots of different options. There are many different ways of looking at the same thing. It's probably useful to think about all of them, or as many of them as you can gather. but it's not going to be exhaustive. Like there's more, that you're not going to complete the collection of wise thoughts about any given topic. And that's an important thing that you need to consider as you are being educated, as you are thinking more about the world. That there isn't a right answer. There are just many good answers.
And always more. I mean, that's one of the things that this text also does that I think is very unusual and really cool. This idea that there's an appetite and it's satisfied, but there's always more. There's always the potential for the desire for more and the delivery of more. And this comes out both with regard to wisdom or aphoristic knowledge, what the philosophers have to offer, like in the case of Alexander's tomb, which you were just talking about, but also with regard to stories themselves. There's this language of appetite that shows up over and over again in the exchange between the teacher and the student, which I think is really neat. So, for example, there's this one moment when the teacher has just told the student the parable of the sword, and the student really enjoyed it. And he says this. The pupil said, "You have told me surprising things about women, but what amazes me most is their presumptuous audaciousness. Nevertheless," I won't comment. "Nevertheless, if it is not too much trouble, I want you to tell me about their tricks. The more you tell me, the greater the reward you deserve." To whom the teacher said, "Are these not enough for you? I've already told you 3 parables, and you still insist?" The pupil replied, "When you say 3 parables, you exaggerate the number, for they were short ones. Now tell me a long story, which will fill my ears and will thus satisfy me." So there's a number of these kinds of exchanges where it's like the pupil's like hungry for stories, clearly, and, gets more or doesn't get more, depending on what the teacher feels like, because it's like eating, right? You don't want to eat so much that you get like overfull and grossed out and stuff like that. So the storytelling really inhabits that realm. And again, that's something that's kind of unusual.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I have many, many thoughts from this. I loved that passage, first off, because it is such an interesting moment about the friction between the student and the teacher. Also, the fact that he's going to offer a reward to the teacher if he entertains him, which is clearly what's actually being asked for here, if he teaches him what he wants to know about, but in a way that, is kind of salacious now and so forth. Like, that's not a father-son relationship. That's you're going to get paid more if you do this. I can't think of what other reward you'd offer to a father. So, which is interesting just in terms of like, who is the dialogue and how does that change when it's the father and the son talking to each other versus the teacher and student versus the philosopher and the follower. Secondly, that ties in with something that he says in his prologue about what his aims are and about sort of the nature of being a student. So he says in the prologue, "I have also observed that the temperament of man is delicate. It must be instructed by being led, as it were, little by little, so that it will not become bored. I am mindful also of its hardness, which must to some extent be softened and sweetened, so that it may retain what it learns with greater facility, remembering that, as it is forgetful, it needs many things to help it remember what it tends to forget." And so that's why he's bringing in all of these stories, he says. But this idea that, like, you have a student who's clearly going to have attention problems, who can't maintain thoughts for a very long time, and that you need to figure out ways of eliciting the attention and bringing the attention back of the student, and that these naughtier stories that the student is demanding might be one way to do it, but then you're sort of worried about them getting too into the naughty stories. You've already heard 3 of them. You don't need more. And I kind of enjoy that it gets resolved by the student offering up a story about a woman to the teacher. It says, "Oh, well, okay, well, here's the story. You don't know this one. I'll tell you this one." And then this teacher's like, "All right, that was good. I will tell you a few more then." And so there's this other type of exchange that goes on that sort of resolves this problem. Well, maybe it doesn't resolve it, but it sort of puts aside this problem of, should we still be talking about this or should we be moving on? Well, now I want to learn something, so I guess we'll stick to this topic.
Yeah. It's really, I'm glad that you read a little bit of that opening, like the way in which he sort of frames what it is he's going to be doing here, that passage about, the temperament of man being delicate, having to be led, but also being hard. So it has to be softened and sweetened. This idea that it's saying something about the nature of education, right? But he's not saying something about the nature of education only for those who are, unlearned, untutored, who are the youngest people who are educated. A little later in the same passage, he says, the knowledgeable will remember what they have forgotten by means of the things which are contained here. In other words, that the morals and fables that are here, the aphorisms and so on, will have an effect on the people who are new to this knowledge, but they'll also have an effect on people who have the knowledge, and it's a question of pulling it back out again. In other words, the idea that education isn't just like there's a blank slate and you fill it up. It's about constantly stimulating and feeding and retrieving knowledge. You know what I mean? That it's not just something that's part of immaturity. It's something that goes on over a long time. I found that really interesting.
It is really neat. But also, I think we should add, on top of all of this, is that we may not be meant to take this passage quite as earnestly as we have been. There's a sense in which it's also like, well, here's the cover. Here's how I'm going to talk about the ways in which this is an educating moral text. And once we all agree that it's suitable for all audiences, for the people who are not educated at all, for the people who are very educated, why everybody can read this book and get something out of it, and there's always a good thing at the end of it. Now let me tell you some stories about some women who sleep around. There's a sense in which it's kind of a cover, and you see that sometimes when the agreement about should we keep talking about this lurid topic that we've already spent so much time on, when that breaks down, we're like, okay, yeah, we will, because it's too good to not talk about. I find that fascinating as well.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I guess maybe, I don't know if this fits in with that or not, but one of the things that I'm really struck by is the ways in which the learning process here is totally not linear. Right. So there's exchanges between the teacher and the pupil, right, that go on. And there's this kind of turning point that happens. And in the translation we have, it's on page 80. It's right after the teacher has offered the parable of the two city dwellers and the countryman. And at the end of it, now it's described as a father-son relation, right? So the son kind of draws out the aphorism. He says, it happened to the people in this story, just as it says in the proverb, he who wanted all lost all. These men resemble the dog. And he goes on to sort of expound it. And he gets to the end of this exposition saying, I wish they had been whipped as the king's tailor was beaten through the cleverness of his pupil Nedui. I heard about it from my teacher some time ago. And the father says, tell me, my boy, what you have heard. What happened to the pupil? Such a story should be very amusing. And then the son tells the parable of Nedui, the king's tailor's apprentice. So it's this odd moment in a couple of different ways. One is that, as you were talking about earlier, that father-son, teacher-student relation is like, we're like, okay, who's the teacher? Who's the, who are these characters in the dialogue? It's always a dialogue, but the players change, right? But the other thing that's so interesting in this passage is that all of a sudden, the junior person in the dialogue is all of a sudden going to tell the story. So it doesn't exactly flip the hierarchy, but it reminds you of the arbitrariness of the hierarchy and how you can kind of, people can inhabit different positions in it. It's always a two-part exchange, but the figures who are in it are going to move around. And this moment when the junior partner tells the story is, I think, kind of a big turning point. But even so, just a little bit later, and here I'm looking further on when there's the section on table manners, which is super weird. Again, you've got the son and the father, and the son, in a really immature way, asks for, these comic stories. The stories of Maimundus, the Negro slave, right? Super racist part of the story, by the way. But he's clearly in the immature, I want good stories, I want funny stories kind of mode, right? So it's not like you go from a lack of knowledge to knowledge and a lack of wisdom to wisdom. It's always in process, which is kind of weird.
Absolutely. But again, that makes even more sense if you're less interested in wisdom and more interested in good stories.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, right? Tasty, tasty stories.
Yeah, no, this is full of them. And I think a lot of later authors would turn to this text and pluck them out and expand upon them. I think a couple of them end up in Boccaccio in the Decameron, right?
Yeah, at least one of them. I think it's in 7-4, I think, Boccaccio 7-4. Yeah, and also in the Gesta Romanorum. I don't know if that's something you've spent much time with.
I've spent a lot of time with it because that is a very good text to give people who are first learning Latin. It is a very similar sort of collection of stories. Gesta Romanorum means the deeds of the Romans, which is the most inaccurate title ever for a collection. But whatever, that's what it's called. And it's just a story. It's just a collection of very short stories about, well, all sorts of things, really, with, as far as I can remember, no particular order to them. Just like, here's a story about the bird and the princess, or here's the princess who went and got a unicorn to sit on its lap and then slit its throat and said, yay, I did it. They're all short. They're all very weird, but they're all very easy to read if you're just beginning to learn Latin.
Is there a frame, or is it just story, story, story?
I don't remember there being a frame. There may be versions that have a frame, but the versions that I always looked at were just here's a tale, here's a tale, here's a tale. I think different manuscripts contain different amounts of stories, or people put stories in all the time because it's incredibly easy to. That was a book that this book reminded me a lot of. Also in the efficiency of which it told its stories. It made me think of that kind of text that is, I took a look at the Latin, and it's not like the hardest Latin I've ever looked at, but it's very efficient. Like, it's written for people who maybe don't have the strongest Latin or aren't looking for a very literary Latin. And like, Petrus's Latin seems competent enough, but like, he wasn't a great stylist or anything. This is just the bare bones efficient approach to storytelling. I think it's interesting in a culture where Latin is held, but maybe not held super well by a lot of potential readers. And maybe people would be translating it on the fly into other languages. I'm not sure.
And also, I mean, interesting thinking about him as a Latinist, like, so presumably, and I'd love to know more about this, presumably Latin is a language he acquires in adulthood, right? I mean, from all we know, it's not a language he grows up in. It'd be worth looking into his dialogi to see if he talks explicitly about that. I don't think he does, but it'd be worth looking into it to see if he does. So what does that do to your Latinity? What is the nature of your Latinity when you come into an adulthood? It's very different from the experience of a lot of the medieval writers that we've thought about before.
Yeah, exactly. What is one of your favorite stories from the collection?
Well, there are stories that are more or less famous. One of the ones that's more famous is the exemplum of the weeping female dog.
Ah, yes.
That one is pretty famous. And it's an awful story because I feel really bad for the dog.
Yep.
But it does stand out. And I think it's one of the ones that finds its way into other collections. It has an afterlife in the medieval French version of this work. And then also I think it finds its way into the Middle English Dame Sirith, I think, too.
So what's the story?
Okay, so the parable of the weeping female dog shows up, I'd say about maybe a third of the way through, and it's one of the more prolonged anecdotes. It tells the story of a man who goes away to pray. He goes away to Rome to pray in the holy places. So implicitly, this is a Christian man, right? And his wife stays behind, living chastely and acting prudently in all ways. But a young man sees her when she's out on household business and falls in love with her. He sends her messages. He really wants to get with her, but she is chaste and virtuous. She's not going to respond. And he's so unhappy. He's lovesick. He doesn't know what he's going to do. So one day, weeping for sorrow, he runs into an old woman wearing the habit of a nun who asks him what's wrong. And the fact that, it's a woman wearing the habit of a nun kind of tips you off that no good is going to come of this encounter. So the old woman says, you're just going to get more and more ill from this. I'll find you a remedy. And so she leaves him, and the old woman goes back to her own house and forced a little dog, which she had at home, to go without food for 2 days. On the third day, she gave the hungry dog bread made with mustard. And as the dog ate the bread, its eyes began to water with the sharpness of the mustard. I feel really bad for the dog. Anyway, the old woman brought the little dog to the house of the chaste woman, and the woman received her respectfully because of her religious appearance. And then the little dog is following the old woman, and the virtuous woman sees the dog weeping, and she said, what's wrong? Why is the dog crying? And the old woman says, dear friend, don't ask what's wrong, because the sorrow is so great, I can hardly talk about it. And the woman begs her, no, please tell me. And the old woman says, well, if you must know, she says, the little dog here was my daughter, who was very chaste and modest, and a young man loved her, but she was so chaste that she rejected him. And the young man pined away, so ill, and for her sin my wretched daughter was turned into a dog. And the older one burst into tears. And then the chaste lady said, oh, this is terrible. I'm guilty of a similar crime because a young man loves me, but because of my love of chastity, I haven't responded. And the old woman says, dear friend, I advise you to have pity on him so this doesn't happen to you, so you're not turned into a dog, just as my daughter was. And so the woman says, please give me advice. What should I do? And the old woman says, I'll go find the young man. Don't worry. I'll bring him back here. Everything's going to be okay. So the woman thanks the old lady, and the old lady goes and gets the young man, and they get together. And the pupil says, wow, I've never heard anything so astounding. I think this is done with black magic.
Oh, what a horrible story.
It is a terrible story. Yeah, you asked me if any stories are my favorites. I'm like, well, it's really memorable. But like, so what I like about this, I mean, it's not the individual stories. Like individual stories are like, I don't get a lot of pleasure out of them. What I'm enchanted by is the rhythm of the text. Like these listy aphorisms. One philosopher says this, one says this, one says this, one says this, or these other kinds of lists that we get every now and then. Another good example of these like little listy moments is there's a section that's on the instability of worldly things. And it opens saying, the Arab said to his son, my son, when something adverse happens to you by chance, don't become too depressed or sad, because this has come to you from God, right? Good things and bad things. Always praise God. And then he says, the philosopher says, all the good things of this world are mixed. You do not eat honey without poison. Another, everything in this world is changeable. Whatever good fortune you're destined to have, you'll have. Another, the sluggard is permitted to obtain his desires, whereas the diligent man is denied what he strives for. Another, the world dishonors him who beautifies himself, and the earth swallows and devours him who idolizes himself. Another, the glory of the world ends in the twinkling of an eye, and since it is fragile, it is plainly not desirable. Like, I just love this rhythm. It's like, and this thing, and this thing. It's the shiny objects from the train window. I love that. So the stories I don't find very exciting, but this like idea of like this thing, this thing, this thing, I find that really cool.
I feel like the stories are also set up that way, though. I mean, your description of the story about the dog was almost the length of how it's presented in the book, right? And again, this sort of efficiency means that you get to the interesting part of the story. It may be kind of ethically gross, and there may be some really upsetting elements to it, but like that central idea of the dog getting fed mustardy bread
I know.
and then being presented as the daughter is such a wild idea. If you haven't encountered that idea before, which I haven't. So it's like, whoa, I did not see that plot twist. I did not see that was where we were going with it.
There are actually a couple of stories in the 1001 Nights that are a little bit like, it's not the same story, but there's a relationship. Like it's the same idea of like, animal transformation and what that makes people do for fear of the possibility that could happen. Like this is a world where that could happen.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That's what's cool. That's what's really cool about that story, right? Like, yeah, this is a world with Christians in it. Like the man goes to Rome, so he's clearly a Christian. The old woman is dressed like a nun, right? And the other woman responds to her positively, right? So this is a world where it's intelligible, right? If somebody's wearing nun clothes, you know what that means about them as a human being, right? And yet the story they're telling, the only ones I know that correspond to it are like Arabic stories. Right. And the belief that, oh my God, if I do this thing wrong, I might get turned into an animal. Like this could happen to you. So this is like in between these worlds in a strange kind of way.
Yeah.
I like that.
So this is the final book in our cluster on education. We've had The Purgatory. We've had Monkey Beach. We've got this. And one of the things that we could think about in terms of how education arises out of them is this notion of education through dialogue. We talked about in Purgatory how some of the education comes from these sort of multi-sensory information points where you see or taste or something. But quite a lot of the education comes from encountering people or shades and having them communicate something to you, Dante.
Well, it depends how you look at it, right? Because for the shades that are in purgatory, like working their way up the mountain, their education, right, their process, it's like they're in an educational landscape in some sense, right? Like all the stuff, all the apparatus around them is part of their journey upward, right?
That's true.
But for Dante, right, for the narrator, it's exactly what you said. The education comes partly from these encounters, these many, many one-on-one encounters, facilitated by his guide.
Because he's got to do it fast.
Yeah.
So that's a more efficient way of doing it, I suppose.
Well, he's doing it in his own time, right? Like all the shades in purgatory are traveling through, I guess you could say almost on God's time, right? Like in other words, they move when they're ready to move, when they're clean enough, right, to move. You know what I mean? Spiritually. Whereas Dante is moving through that landscape in a slightly different time frame or in a different current, if you imagine it as a river or something. But all of them are going through some kind of educational process.
In Monkey Beach, we had a kind of contrast being made between the education happening with Mama'u and with her uncle, which often happened through dialogue. You know, they were talking to each other. They were also going out and looking at the world and doing things. But there was a lot of communication back and forth. And both of those teachers were people who accepted Lisa as somebody who was sort of real, like a real communicant who could, give as well as take or in a conversation, as opposed to what was happening at residential schools for some people in her, the previous generation, or what even happened to her at the regular school, so to speak, which was not based on a dialogic model, but was much more, read this passage aloud. Here's this sort of institutional thing, and it was all very punitive, especially at the residential schools. But it was a very different mode of education.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, right? Like it is dialogic in the sense that we see her with her Uncle Mick. Lisa Marie's with her Uncle Mick for a period of time, and then she's with her Mamo. But I feel like one of the things that's happening there too is that what she's learning from is the land and the natural environment itself, right? Like in other words, she has a guide, I guess you could say, each time. But especially with Mamo, it's also like the landscape itself is kind of teaching her.
Sure, yeah.
I get the sense that's part of what's happening there.
Which was also true for Dante in the Purgatorio, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So here we don't have a landscape.
No, we have zero landscape. I mean, I like this idea of the view of the fields from the train window. I think that's kind of happening. But yeah, we get nothing of that. It's just these two voices.
And even within the stories, there's no time for landscape details unless they're absolutely pertinent to the story.
No, it's very spare, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, the language is spare and the scenarios are spare. The structure is spare, like sprawling and yet spare at the same time, which is again bizarre. But the dialogic quality I find absolutely fascinating. And the fact that, it changes, like we were saying earlier, like, teacher, student, father, son, there's like these different kinds of relations, but it's always two-part. It's always like, I think of it as like, I don't know, a tennis game or something. It's like ba-boom, 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 ba-boom. The rhythm of this text is kind of extraordinary. And it makes you wonder, like, what kind of teaching model is that? Like, what are the pros and what are the cons of this two-part teaching model? Like sometimes we think about that as a really exalted form, right? We talk about things like the Socratic dialogue or the Socratic method, right? Or we talk about these like Greek antecedents, right? And the idea of the dialogue where it's the more knowledgeable person and the less knowledgeable person, yet the more knowledgeable person, like Socrates in Plato's dialogues, draws knowledge out of the person who doesn't even know he has it, right? So there's this kind of valorization, this history of celebrating the two-part dialogue, right? But there's all these other ways of thinking about education as well. I mean, I guess is something that's been on my mind a lot, like having read a little bit over the last few years, more indigenous writers and different models of how teaching and learning might happen. And, understanding this as emerging from communities or emerging from the landscape itself. Like for a long time, I kind of understood the dialogue as the default form of learning, but now I'm like, oh, that's one thing among a bunch of other possibilities. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think about the dialogue? Is that a format that you've thought about much? I mean, and like I said, also the 12th century history of this is incredibly interesting. Like this text is important for what happens in the later part of the century.
One of the things that I was thinking about earlier when we were talking about the section about Alexander's golden tomb in the middle of the courtyard was the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas, which is, 100 or so years later, which is presented as a kind of dialogue, but it's very much a dialogue of one person to themselves. And it is structured by bringing up a question that we're going to, debate, and then the respondent answering with, well, here's one theory.
A contra.
Said contra, but here's another theory. Here's one theory, here's another theory, but no, said contra. But in fact, I think you'll find that here's the answer. And it always comes to a very neat and unitary answer. Unless I'm wrong, I haven't read it, I'll admit. But like from the bits that I've looked at, it seems like it always is driving at a particular answer while, giving all sorts of different viewpoints some airing. It nevertheless is going to say, this is where we're ending up, which is a move that the Disciplina Clericalis just does not do.
No, I think that's exactly right. And that's, not to generalize, but that's the big difference between 13th century scholasticism and the kind of weird stuff that's going on in the 12th century. I mean, the 12th century is this great century. There's all this possibility that's been opened up by the translations that are happening, by the movement of people. Like there's all kinds of possibility happening within Latin literature and also vernacular literature. And the Disciplina Clericalis is really part of that. And I think Petrus Alphonsi, more than anybody else I can think of in the 12th century, really exploits the inherent weirdness of the dialogue format. And you see it here in the Disciplina Clericalis, but also this other work of his that I mentioned, the dialogue between the Jew and the Christian, which is like him and him, right? Moses and Peter. Like he'll play that out. And like 100 years later in Aquinas, there's a foregone conclusion, like Christianity is going to win, spoiler alert, right? but that you're going to air it all out, that you're really going to play it out in terms of a divided self. I find that really neat.
You say that, but one of my favorite weird writers from the 13th century is Ramon Llull. And he's got a book called The Book of the Gentile and the Three Wise Men, which has a person who has lost all faith. It's one of the few depictions of anything close to atheism that we have from European Middle Ages, and happens to run across a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim, and is like, perfect. Let us talk about your different faiths. And each one takes a turn getting interrogated and so forth and defending their faith. And you think, this is clearly going to end with the Christian winning. And it kind of does from the outside, but at the end of the dialogue, the person who's lost his faith is like, well, that was interesting. I don't know what my answer is. I'm going to keep thinking on it. This was fun. Goodbye. And it does not get resolved, which is an astonishing move. So, there's all sorts of weird possibilities space at that time.
No, it's true. I mean, and you get, there's also a dialogue by Peter Abelard later in the 12th century, a dialogue between a Jew, a Christian, and a philosopher. And clearly philosopher is sort of serving the role of Muslim in that conversation.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And so that's what I mean by the 12th century being a kind of a period when a lot of possibilities get opened up and things are open for debate, both in philosophy, theology, and in science, right? Natural philosophy, in ways that get kind of closed down a little bit in the following century. So this book is kind of a neat little porthole into that period of possibility.
Yeah. Although, again, I feel like I've said this a lot, but I feel like its inability to commit to the dialogue form. It's willing to just sort of there's a dialogue. Now there's not. Oh, now there is again. Maybe it's different people. Maybe it's the same people. I don't know. I don't care. This is a book. Just enjoy it.
Yeah. Well, one of the contexts you can see this work in also is this genre of Arabic literature, Adab. It's very difficult to translate. Sometimes it's rendered as kind of belles lettres. Sometimes it's rendered as kind of conduct literature. It's basically a kind of a grab bag of different kinds of things, short verses, short stories, advice about what you might do or not do, sometimes very exalted advice, sometimes very low-level advice like table manners. We actually get table manners, a little section on table manners here in the Disciplina Clericalis, which is very trippy. So, that kind of miscellany kind of quality, barely organized miscellany quality, you can read it in that framework as well.
Yeah, Adab is one of those genres that I have heard a bit about here and there when I was doing my medieval studies stuff, but I don't think much of it has been translated into English, and I'm super curious about it, even if it doesn't sound like something I would, totally love to read. I would like to get a better taste of what that was all about.
This might be something we should look for.
Yeah, maybe. But it's not what we're doing next.
No, what are we doing next?
Well, it's been a long year, and we thought maybe we should come up with
so long.
Yeah, it has. Maybe we should come up with a slightly fun topic to look at. And what is a more fun topic than sex?
It's going to get us through election day, if nothing else.
Oh, God, I don't want to think about those two in the same sentence. So, actually, there are many things that may be more fun than sex, but we're going to do sex. Let's not be too. Sex is the best normative, whatever you want to call that. But nevertheless, there's obviously lots of interesting things to say about it. So we're going to do a trilogy of works from very different times and very different places that look at sex in the same way. No, in very different ways. Or maybe not. We'll find out when we read or reread them. The first book we're going to look at is going to be the most recent of the books that we're going to talk about, because it's one that you also just read for the first time, finally, not too long ago, and are super excited to talk about.
I am. I loved it.
And it is by one of my favorite authors and a book that I love quite a lot and have read many times, and I'm looking forward to rereading again. It is Times Square Red, Times Square Blue by Samuel Delany.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking about that together.
It's really interesting. It's nonfiction. It is one half sort of memoir of his time going to pornographic theaters in New York and having random sexual encounters there. And then the second half is a theoretical essay about the implications of doing just that. And it's amazing.
And they're like, the way those two parts fit together, I think is so interesting. I can't wait to talk about that.
The second text that we will be looking at is the Mahabharata, which is a text that I don't know very much about at all, except that it's really, really long.
Well, it's the great Sanskrit epic. I feel that, it is long overdue for us to pay some attention to. And thinking about it in terms of sex and sexuality and vitality and growth and time, like how that's a kind of an engine that drives the universe, I think that'll be a really neat way to approach it.
Oh, I'm super looking forward to it. I've heard some interesting things about it over the years, just have not sat down to read. And we're not going to read all of it, obviously.
We'll pick and choose.
It is... How long is this again? It is...
Long. It's long. It's long.
It is 10 times longer than the Iliad and Odyssey combined, more or less.
Oh my God.
1.8 million words.
Okay, so we're not going to read all those words.
Nope.
But we will read some of the words and report.
We will read the best, sexiest words. And then we're going to wrap off this cluster by doing a bit of poetry, which we've done some poetry, and I guess the Mahabharata is poetry, but some lyric poetry, which we really haven't looked at all.
The only time we did lyric poetry is when we did Whitman, and, that was within the kind of framework of Leaves of Grass, which is a different thing, right?
Yeah, that's barely lyric poetry, and sort of forging its own genre, I suppose. But looking at something a bit more traditional, we're going to be looking at some of the metaphysical poets, maybe looking at John Donne and Andrew Marvell in particular, but there may be some other ones. We will put together a little collection of them and offer them up for you, but we'll also link to an anthology if you want to read more as well. So those will get us through till basically the end of the year.
I can't believe we're coming close to the end of the second year.
I can't believe it's like May already.
Actually, it's still March. I have it under the throat.
Well, on that note, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter at @thespouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/36, and the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So, until next time.
Until next time, see you again at the Spouter-Inn.